Alrighty, welcome along to those who've jumped in this afternoon. My name's Christy Spire. I'm the team leader of nature education here at Green Adelaide, and it's awesome to join you all for the third instalment of our seminar series for 2024. And I'll give you a little bit of a bit more detail into what it's all about, but just really like to start our seminar series by acknowledging country, Marni Nganlu Tampanti, Nganlu Ghana, Yatanga Imperenthi. And that means that we acknowledge that we meet on the land of the Ghana people, even though I'm 4 stories above it, and that we really acknowledge and respect their connection with this beautiful land, waters, and the community around us today. And know that many of you online work together with Ghana here to care for country and to support them in doing what they've done for thousands and thousands of years. And it's a great honour to learn from their practices as well. So this is, as I said, our third instalment, and we're running these series to really share the great work that happens across Adelaide every day to make it cooler, greener, wilder and more climate resilient. This session is being recorded and will be available on the Green Adelaide YouTube channel. You're invited to ask questions at any time by putting them into the chat. You don't have access to your microphones today, but we will try and answer as many of these as we can at the end of the session. So today's session is with Dr. Stefan Caddy-Retalic, and we are going to be looking at why it's not easy being green and how to keep Adelaide's trees healthy in an age of climate change. Stefan has played a key role in the Future Trees project, which he's going to tell us more about, which has mapped the diversity and demographics of Adelaide's urban forest. This information helps to identify which trees are vulnerable and which species and cultivars we should plant more of to ensure a healthy and resilient urban forest. So we're looking forward to discussing which trees are dominant in our urban forest, what vulnerabilities they might have, and how we can improve our tree management into the future. So Stefan comes to us as a botanist and an ecologist with research experience in plant and invertebrate ecology, molecular biology, natural resource management and science communication. He's an adjunct lecturer at the University of Adelaide and also at the Uni of Sydney. So I'm going to stop sharing and hand over to you to take us on a tree adventure this afternoon. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Christy. Really appreciate that generous introduction. I will try and share my screen. Is that coming through for everyone?
Coming through.
Excellent.
Brilliant.
Okay, well, I would also like to acknowledge that I'm presenting from the land of the Ghana, who are the traditional custodians of the Adelaide Plains, and I recognise their ongoing connection to this country, even through its extensive modification. It's great to see that there's a new interest in working with Ghana to improve care for country, and hopefully this will re-nourish the land that we share and depend upon. I'd also really like to acknowledge the team that I worked on with this project, particularly Dr. Kate Delaporte from the Wade Arboretum, Dr. James Dorey, who's just moved to the University of Wollongong, and Dr. Eleanor Dormont from the University of Adelaide. They were pivotal in doing this work. So the first thing that I think that we need to start the first question we need to ask ourselves when we look at our urban forests and how we're managing them is, what should an urban forest look like? What do we want to achieve? And I think it can be broken down into the idea that an urban forest should be extensive. We should have lots of trees. We should be a green Adelaide. And that's an idea that's really taken hold over the past few years, which is great. We should have a diverse urban forest. We shouldn't just be living in a plantation of a single species. We need to have a range of different trees, a range of different tree ages and sizes, and trees that do different things, that support different wildlife. And we need to have a functional urban forest. We ask a lot out of trees, and we need a range of trees to be able to fill all of the different roles that they play for us. And there's been a lot of discussion about the first of those, about the idea of urban forest being extensive, and we're very interested in measuring the urban forest extent for that reason. And the recent LiDAR release is a good example of that, and I'll touch on that briefly. I'm going to spend most of my time today talking about that second part, the diversity, and then I'm going to touch at the end on the idea of function. So in terms of what an urban forest should look like, there are a couple of rules of thumb that have come out. And the first that I'm going to talk about is the 330-300 rule, which has gained a lot of prominence since being suggested a few years ago by Cecil Conandick. And he suggests that from your house or work, you should be easily able to see 3 trees. You should be able to look out your window and see nature, basically. Your neighbourhood should have around 30% canopy cover, so there should be lots of trees around so that you get the benefits of those trees. And you should be able to access a park or green space within 300 metres or an easy walk of your home, somewhere that you can go and kick a ball or watch a bird or somehow meaningfully interact with nature. And this is an idea that I think that planners are really locked onto as well, because I think we all look at that and we think, yeah, that does sound like a pretty nice place to live and work. A little while ago, back in 1990, Frank Santamore from the US National Arboretum suggested another rule of thumb, which was the 10-20-30 rule for tree diversity. And he suggested that no urban tree population, so the trees within a city, should comprise more than 10% of any given species. So that might be a blue gum, no more than 20% of any given genus, so that might be eucalyptus, and no more than 30% of any given family, and that might be the Myrtaceae family. And the reason for that was due to disease outbreaks in the United States and Europe following the introduction of Dutch elm disease and some other pathogens that really decimated populations of dominant tree species there. This didn't incorporate the idea of trees being vulnerable to climate change. And more recently, the Moreton Arboretum has suggested that this should be updated to no more than 5% of any one species, 10% of any one genus, and 20% of any one family. So those are some 2 rules of thumb that I will refer to from time to time in this presentation. So talking about tree cover, first of all, so this is the extent of our urban forest. This is quite readily measured. We can do this with airborne LiDAR or image analysis with aerial photography, but it can be quite expensive. It can also helpfully generate other metrics like total green cover, permeable surfaces, building footprints, digital elevation models, and those kind of things, which can be quite helpful and add to the benefit of collecting it. So following the release of the most recent LiDAR capture conducted in 2022, Adelaide is currently sitting at about a 17% canopy. This is actually a rise from a few years ago, probably due to mild La Nina conditions over the past few years and strong tree planting efforts from local governments. But overall, canopy is still worrying low, and we're still seeing ongoing loss of trees, particularly on private land. We also see that the city is very heterogeneous. So some suburbs in Greater Adelaide have close to a 50% tree canopy level, which is fantastic, but others have less than 2%. So there's barely a tree in those suburbs, which is a real worry. And there are certainly many properties that can't view 3 trees from their house, and many, many, many that don't have a green space within 300 metres. This is often correlated with socioeconomic vulnerability, and so poorer suburbs and unhealthier suburbs often have the fewest trees, and these households are probably those that need them the most. So this work is ongoing, but there's a lot of work to try and make sure that we have equitable access to green space in Adelaide. So now on to diversity. First of all, I want to just ask the question, why do we care? Because there's actually really good evidence that people don't like tree diversity. Every different tree type is a risk. It brings new risks of behaving in ways that we don't know or we don't like. And so there can be a tendency from residents and from arborists to say, let's just plant proven performers. And this can lead to the kind of images that we see as characteristic of our streetscapes in Adelaide that I've grabbed here. So jacarandas in the city of Burnside, plane trees in the city of Unley, some Norfolk Island pines down on the Holdfast Bay foreshore, and some oaks in the Adelaide Hills Council. And what you'll notice that all these have in common is that they're monocultures. Trees of one kind, usually of the same age, planted at the same time in evenly spaced avenues. And this will mean that they'll all grow together and look lovely. And The reason that this can be a bit of a risky idea is that when some kind of threat comes along that threatens one of these trees, it threatens all of them. And we can see that when we look at the case study of elms in North America. So this is the North American elm, and when elms were planted heavily in North America, they were identified as having a reliable form, an attractive structure. They formed this lovely branching canopy that met over roadways, and beautiful autumn colour. And when Dutch elm disease was introduced, those trees were completely obliterated, and there are very few elms left in North America or Europe, even in the wild, as a result of that. Elms were largely replaced by ash trees, which had a similar form after those trees were lost, and then an ash pest was introduced, and those ash trees were also lost. Sorry, it wasn't an ash but borer, it was an ash wilt disease, ash dieback disease. And so the same thing happened. And so now there is a much greater emphasis on a diversity of plantings to make sure that the loss of any one tree species is not going to have this disproportionate impact. So we need to plant a diversity of trees to reduce the spread of pest and disease, to limit the impact that the loss of any one species will have due to climate change, and recognise that many of the species that we plant here in Adelaide, they're not in their optimal climate zone. So this includes favourites like jacarandas, pears, leuphostomans, which are the Queensland box, plane trees, and even some of our local species that are starting to move outside of their preferred climate range. So we need to recognise that these species are likely at risk. The kind of analysis that I'm going to talk today has only just become possible because most of the councils in Adelaide have started to invest in platforms like Forestry and Tree Plotter that record and track every tree. Prior to this, trees tended to be dealt with a bit like grass or flower beds or something like that. They were just part of the landscape, and we didn't track every individual tree. Following concerns about insurance and risk management, there's been this shift to need to manage every tree and make sure that it's inspected regularly, and trees are being treated much more like assets. These kind of data platforms geo-reference each and every tree, and data of relevance is collected, including the location, height, health, diameter at breast height, can include things like planting date, pruning and maintenance information, etc. And it also allows platforms to be built that allow for the public to explore tree data, as well as more sophisticated planning and analysis. And this is a screen grab that I've got from the Marion Tree Portal, where you can see all of their trees that they've planted in some of their streets, and each of those tree species is planted is shown in a different colour there, so you can explore that. And each of those trees you can click on, see what trees outside your house, when it was planted, when it was last watered, and so on. It also allows councils to start doing some very sophisticated future planning. So rather than being completely reactive and saying, oh, there's a tree here that needs attention and we better get on it right now, they can start to plan their maintenance and planting programs about 7 years in advance. And City of Marion has been able to connect its tree database to a dynamic asset management plan and contractor management system, in addition to its public-facing tree portal. So it allows a whole bunch more processes to be connected and a much more sophisticated approach to urban forestry, which is really exciting for those of us who work in tree management. So noting that is that investment in data is what has made this project possible. My team collected tree data from all 20 councils across Greater Adelaide. And so we got a whole bunch of Excel spreadsheets and data dumps containing over 600,000 individual trees. We really appreciated the willingness of all of the councils to share their data for this work, and there was huge variability in the data that was held by councils. Some councils had amazingly detailed data, others were much more starting out on that process. It's a big challenge, particularly for the larger peri-urban councils, to collect all of this tree data. So definitely a challenge. The results that we got, or that tree data you can see in the map there on the right. And so this is a density map. So the red blobs there are areas of high tree density, and the bluer blobs are areas of low tree density. So you can see that throughout the Adelaide Hills and Onkaparinga and those peri-urban councils, you can see a few, tree records in some of the outer areas, but certainly the vast majority are around the large population centres. We then went through a process where we cleaned all of that data and unified its taxonomy so that we made sure they were all talking about the same tree species and cultivars. And we came up with 650 taxa and 560,000 georeference trees that we could use for this analysis. And I believe that that's the largest tree database of any individual city anywhere to date, which is a really great effort. And here's what we found. So Shannon Diversity Index is a commonly used index in vegetation ecology to measure vegetation diversity, and greater scores indicate greater species richness, so more species, and evenness, so a number of species all with high abundance. You would ideally compare data of the same size, which we don't have, and so that's a limitation here. So what we can see is that the city of, Greater Adelaide rather, had a Shannon Diversity Index of about 4.2, which is very high. And it's the highest of all of the international examples that I could find, sitting well above Melbourne, which is just above 3, and Taipei, which is just below 3, certainly above all of the European cities there, and those in America as well, which is fantastic to see. I thought that this might be largely to do with the size of the urban forest database that we had and the extent of the Greater Adelaide area, which is very big. But even individual councils in Adelaide range from 2.91 to 4.05. So that indicates that we're still doing pretty well using the Shannon Diversity Index as a starting point, which is a great first finding. So I was pleased at that. There's a new metric that's been put out recently, though, which I thought might be more useful, which is the total diversity index. And this is the number of species that are required to reach 50% abundance. So if you imagine all across Adelaide, what the fewest number of species that you would need to include to reach half of the trees in Adelaide would be. So it's basically saying, what are the most, how many really dominant species do we have to get to 50%? And this is potentially a more useful measure of diversity because it's a little bit easier to conceptualize. And I think it's going to become quite a common urban forestry metric in coming years. So for Greater Adelaide, the TD50 was 13. And individual councils ranged from 4 up to 12. And there was a really great range there. Because this is a newer measure, there's only one set of international benchmarks that I could compare against. So the Adelaide councils are all there in white, and some regions within the state of California are there in pink. And you can see that California is sitting quite a bit higher than Adelaide, but these are they're areas within a large state rather than individual local government areas. So I don't think that's a huge shock. But this really does show that overall we're planting a handful of really dominant trees very heavily, particularly in some of those council areas that have really low values here. So I'm looking at Gawler, Unley, Walkerville, these councils. And that's potentially of quite a lot of concern. So now let's have a look at how diversity varies spatially. So this is a map of Greater Adelaide that's been gridded into 1 hectare cells, and each cell has been coloured by the number of tree species within that cell. So there's lots of dark blue there, representing only 1 or 2 species per hectare. So a hectare is 100 metre by 100 metre square. Orange and red areas show areas of higher diversity. getting up above 10 for orange and above 17 for red. Note that the largest areas of dark blue here are in the peri-urban areas, and in some cases this is due to poor data capture, the fact that we haven't censused all of the trees in the outer metropolitan areas, but also the fact that those suburbs have been developed all at once with a small species palette. So developers have come in, they've said we're going to build 10,000 houses here or 100 houses, but lots of houses, and we're going to plant these 3 species here. So over time, we would expect those species to diversify, but at the moment, they're low diversity suburbs. Older suburbs have a mixture of new and old development, and so a much patchier and more diverse urban forest. And I appreciate that this is a big area, and so it's a small map to look at. So we're going to zoom in on a couple of areas here. So this is the city centre here. You can see the city of Adelaide there in the upper right. And you can see diversity hotspots in the Adelaide parklands and also in the inner eastern suburbs. And this is those areas that have been around for a long time that have had that opportunity to diversify as development has occurred. If we zoom in here to the city of Marion, we can see and I picked Marion because it's got one of the most complete tree censuses in Adelaide. We can really see the difference between the older, richer northern suburbs and the newer southern suburbs. The same trend is present across Greater Adelaide. And this points to a bit of a socio-economic barrier, with some of our poorer suburbs missing out on the benefits of a high diversity canopy. Okay, I hope this doesn't push the afternoon attention span too far, because I know that there's nothing that audiences like than a big table. But these are the top tree species in Adelaide in terms of species, genera, and families. The 20 species here account for 62% of Adelaide's urban forest. And so it would be no surprise that species like jacarandas, blue gums, and Queensland box are our most abundant taxa. I've highlighted a few taxa here in red that sit above those targets, the Santamore targets that I suggested, the 5, 10, 15 rule at the beginning of the presentation. And the yellow ones there are ones that are starting to approach those limits, and that we probably need to look at deprioritising so that they don't become overly abundant. I've also highlighted the Manchurian pears and I've highlighted Manchurian pears because they're grown on calorie pear rootstock, and the weeping bottle brushes there because we plant almost entirely cultivars which are hybridized with crimson bottle brush. So they're very, very similar species. And if you combine calorie pears and Manchurian pears, they become our most abundant species in Adelaide at 7.35%, and the 2 bottle brushes come up to 6.95% of all of the trees, making them the second most dominant tree species in Adelaide. I also have highlighted there that we need to have a bit of a think about eucalyptus, because we've got about 22% eucalyptus in Adelaide, and about 44% of the Myrtaceae family. And that's very high from urban forestry standards, and is a potential vulnerability of our urban forest. But from an ecological standpoint, it's probably appropriate to have a very high abundance of eucalypts and Myrtaceae, because that is what our native ecosystems look like. So that's a problem that needs to be reconciled, and we need to maintain, of course, our important native ecosystems and the character of our streets and the prominence of our native species, but we also need to make sure that we're managing risk, because some of the threats, it doesn't matter what's been here before. Those biosecurity and climate threats still remain. So it's an open issue for us to resolve. If we take those top 20 species and we now try and map their climatic vulnerability, this is a big ask, but our ability to predict which species are going to be most climatically sensitive it's limited. The best tool out there at this point in time is the Which Plant Where tool, which was developed out of Macquarie University, and they've done really extensive modelling, which gives us some good insight into that work. And that's what I've presented here. So it's not perfect, but it's definitely the best we have at this point in time. And you can see here that there are a number of species that I've highlighted in orange that are highlighted as marginal, and some species in red that the modelling shows are unsuitable for Adelaide conditions in as little as 6 years' time. And given that we plant trees to last for 50 plus years, this is a real worry. I think that some of these are a little bit questionable. I don't think that we can expect these red species to suddenly be unable to grow in Adelaide in 6 years' time. And I also suspect that some of the subtropical species, like the jacarandas and the lophostomans, which are currently green, will start to struggle with aridity and heat waves. So they might be more at risk than this modelling suggests. And that may also be true of temperate species like the pears and Coleritarias. But keeping in mind that this table captures 62% of Adelaide's trees on public land, more than 27% of those trees are considered marginal or unsuitable for the climate of 2030, which is only 6 years away. And that rises to just under a third by 2070, which is 46 years away. And when we compare that to the expected lifespan of a street or reserve tree, that's a real concern. Some of these more vulnerable trees may not be able to be grown in the longer term, or we might need to include more worsted treatments to ensure that they get enough water. Either way, we're going to have to be a lot more careful about which trees we plant where in the future to make sure that they're surviving. So what should we do? I've highlighted some concerns here, but what should we do to improve diversity? So the first thing is that we need to retain as many trees as we can. We certainly don't need to be removing trees, even if we think that they might be vulnerable. The second is that we need to broaden the genetic diversity of our provenances. Many of our most popular trees, including most of our exotics and anything that's a cultivar, is grown from cuttings and is therefore a clone. And has no genetic diversity. That means that they have the exact same susceptibility to a new pest or disease or a climate impact, and so they have no capacity to start to evolve in response to threats. So we need to look at boosting that genetic diversity. 3, we need to look at reducing our reliance on dominant exotics, particularly if they're climatically vulnerable. So they're from climates that are gentler than Adelaide. And I'm thinking here particularly about things like jacarandas, pears, and lophostomans. We need a better understanding of what species are climatically vulnerable, and that's a process that the Which Plant Where tool can give us some insight into, but we don't have good modelling of all of the species that are grown in Adelaide, and we don't know which are going to be most susceptible to the severe drought and heatwave events that we know are going to become increasingly common in Adelaide. We also need to develop a better understanding of climate and biosecurity vulnerability. So modelling's great, but we need some more in-ground experimentation. And the Future Trees project team that's done this work has put together a proposal for a Future Trees hub to develop some of the answers to these questions. 5, we need to try new things, plant new things, experiment, share ideas and data. And it's very hard to predict how a tree will respond to climate or a pest and disease. And what I'm talking about here is managing the risks the best we can based on what we know. But that's never going to replace real world experience and trying new things in the field, because the proof is always in the pudding, and gardeners that try new things always come up with surprising results. And if we share those results with one another, then we can come up with new approaches that will definitely help. And finally, I've suggested here that we consider whether uniform avenues are the best planting approaches. One of the biggest limitations to achieving a higher tree diversity is our attachment to uniform avenues. And this is a bit of a sacred cow for landscape architects and city planners. And I'm not saying that we can't have some avenues, but if we insist on having only streets that have one species of tree down both sides, then that's always going to be a limitation to our diversity. But I do think that there are other approaches that we could integrate, like having mixed avenues of 2 or 3 species that are alternating to give that sense of consistency while also bringing in more species diversity. So I said at the start that I was going to talk about extent, diversity, and function. And so we're finally going to get to function now. And when we talk about what we want from our urban forests, when I had a quick think about it, I came up with this list. There's a whole bunch of things there: reducing urban heat, looking nice, stabilizing the soil, promoting biodiversity, suppressing noise, not catching on fire, all of these things. And there are a whole bunch of things that we don't want our trees to do as well. We don't want them to drop limbs. We don't want them to disturb our fences and foundations and lift our pavers. We don't want them to drop annoying litter. We don't want them to provoke allergies. We don't want them to shade our solar panels. There's a big long list here. And arborists have been making calls on how to meet these needs for decades based on their personal knowledge. But in an increasingly contested urban landscape impacted by increasing climate, biosecurity, and competing values, this is becoming harder than ever to achieve. We are not yet in a good position to plan for function at a landscape scale. We can't really do that. And to achieve this properly, we need to understand how the community values trees and open space. What kind of trees do they like? Do the trees that are valued in Port Adelaide Enfield match the trees that are valued in Burnside? And is that the same as the trees in Mount Barker? Which trees we can reliably grow in our area? Which plantware has shown that while we can make some good educated guesses, this isn't an easy question to answer and still depends on a lot of unknown factors. And finally, the traits of the trees that we choose to grow. And at the moment, trees are squeezed out of the landscape because they interfere with other community values. But being able to connect individual tree species and cultivars with those traits that I've put there on the left, things like reducing heat, having shade, being attractive, not dropping litter, and being able to connect those to species A and species B so that we can start planning our urban forest on a values basis, will stop us planting low value trees and make sure that every tree makes the best contribution it can to the urban forest. And the Future Trees Hub team are working to gain some support to answer some of those questions. So next steps. What's happening here in Adelaide? State and local governments are in discussion to develop an urban greening strategy to arrest canopy decline and manage canopy beyond individual councils. And Green Adelaide has done so much work on this. I know that Green Adelaide staff have been working on this for a long time and are just about to launch some public consultation on that, which I know everyone is very excited to see. The Future Trees project is going to start shifting to identifying which trees we can trial in South Australia and identifying ways to boost the genetic diversity of plantings here. And that includes within species diversity for clonally produced trees. And a group of councils in Southern Adelaide are working together on a common data standard, which will improve data sharing and allow for analysis of other diversity attributes. So things like tree size, as well as just species and cultivar diversity. We will continue to work with key stakeholders like SA Power Networks, SA Water, and the Department for Infrastructure and Transport, as well as across local and state government groups to improve the harmony between green and grey infrastructure. But that is a big challenge, so that's going to have to continue to be a big priority. And I guess my take-home messages are that we need to be managing our urban forests for extent, which we can do through remote sensing, LiDAR or aerial imagery, diversity through data sharing and analysis, and function. And we're not there yet, but hopefully soon. And I've given some ideas on how we can do that. Investment in good data and platforms makes 2 and 3 a whole lot easier. We have a really heavy reliance in Adelaide on a handful of tree species, which could present a major problem as our climate shifts from Mediterranean to semi-arid, and or if we have biosecurity threats arrive here that our trees are vulnerable to. And these include pests and diseases that are already here in Australia but haven't yet reached South Australia, as well as threats that are currently outside Australia but may well arrive. And we have outbreaks of those from time to time. Just recently, we've had an outbreak of giant pine scale, which is currently under control, but I think scared a few people. We would certainly be wise to start spreading the risk that we have over a wider planting palette. And finally, Adelaide is at the scary end of climate impacts on trees because we are shifting from that Mediterranean to semi-arid climate. And we have a lot of work to do, but we can share our efforts with other cities. People globally are really interested in what's happening in Adelaide because the solutions that we come up with can work elsewhere. And that provides a really exciting opportunity for Adelaide to start developing the knowledge and even the actual trees, and developing a much more diverse nursery industry, growing more, excuse the pun, homegrown cultivars that we can export across Australia and potentially overseas. So we've got some really exciting economic opportunities that this presents as well. I'd like to thank my collaborators again, and particularly the funders. So Green Adelaide has been a supporter of this work, as has the University of Adelaide, Preventative Health SA, SA Power Networks, and the Resilient South Council, who have been very generous with helping my time. So thank you very much, and be delighted to answer some questions.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Stefan. Lots to chew over there. And yeah, thank you so much for summarising all those take homes in those 3 areas of extent, diversity and function. They'll definitely stick with me. So that's fabulous. There's so much information in this space, so to kind of summarise how you've done is awesome. So we do have a few questions in the chat box already, and feel free to add in any more if you should like. I'll start maybe. There's some interest around sort of the native species, and kind of, I know that you might have had a little bit of information because you don't quite have the species information that we should be planting in the future, but what native trees do we need more of in urban settings? And then another kind of secondary question around what importance is there for local provenance and species in avoiding the effects of climate change? So that one's a little bit broader, but just in terms of local provenance and native, do you want to make a comment on those?
It's a tricky area, and it's one that we need to think about pretty carefully, because we certainly want to protect our and as a starting point, let me say that in this project, I have approached it as an urban forester, so someone who is looking to create a vibrant network of trees without necessarily a strong focus on maintaining local ecology, which of course is very, very important. And I'm an ecologist by background, so that's not my standard way of operating, but I wanted to try and do this in a reasonably. I just wanted to talk about it in raw diversity terms. Protecting native species is definitely a key function area as well, and I would suggest that areas of native vegetation we don't manage in the same way as urban forests. They do form part of the urban forest, but we can sort of exclude native vegetation and manage that in a different way, make sure that we're maintaining those local provenances, but also looking at bolstering those with genes from more arid areas, and giving them the diversity that they need, those species the diversity they need to be able to cope with ongoing threats due to climate and pest and disease. So we need to maintain gene flow to be able to do that. In terms of which things we need to be planting more of, I've got a couple of slides that I might just share, if that's all right, Christy.
Sure, go for it.
So I'm asked a bit about which trees we should plant, and keeping in mind that a good urban tree should be expected to last for about 50 years, and within that time, Adelaide could reasonably have expected to warm by about 2 degrees and have much longer periods of hot and dry weather, so regular heat waves and droughts. We should sort of think a bit about where we can find plants that tolerate those conditions. And if you look at a climate map of the world, Central Australia is a pretty good starting point. And I happened to find myself there at the end of last year for some field work I was doing, and so I I collected seed and censused a range of trees while I was there. This is Adelaide hemiglorca. It's in the Sapondaceae family, so related to the Colruyterias. It looks very much like the ashes. It has a nice open spreading canopy, wide soil tolerances, and is already grown as a street tree in Alice Springs, currently being trialled at a couple of locations in Adelaide. This is Codonocarpus, the desert poplar. It's in the Gyrosimonaceae family, so not closely related to any of our popular street trees at the moment. It's got a columnar form and grows up to 10 metres tall. Again, wide soil tolerances, fast growing. This could be a really good alternative to some of the ornamental pears. This is Corymbia opaca, the desert bloodwood. This is a bit of a mallee form, this photo, but it tends to be more upright. It can grow to up to 15 metres tall. This is not closely related to our local eucalypt species, so might be a good way of introducing some diversity as well. It's got beautiful flowers as well. This is the desert oak, and this is a juvenile one. It's in the Casuarinaceae family, so related to our she oaks. This gets up to about 16 metres tall, is columnar to start with, but its canopy spreads with maturity. And so here's a mature one, and these are a really graceful tree. So these species aren't necessarily the silver bullet, but they're examples of the kind of things that we could be trialing and that might represent useful trees to grow more of in the future.
Yeah, awesome. Fantastic. Yes, some of those trees are very familiar. I grew up in Alice Springs, so they look like home. Question is, are you hearing anything about species selection lists, provenance and nursery pipeline for availability? Is that, that question's like availability for those new types of trees? Is that maybe, I think perhaps what they're alluding to?
Yeah, I think availability is going to be a really key issue because the nursery industry is, and in many ways needs to be, quite conservative because it takes several years, takes about 3 years to grow a tree to the point where you can sell it to a local council for planting on a road verge or in a reserve. And that's a big investment, and it's unreasonable to expect the nursery industry to start growing all kinds of wild and exotic things on the basis that they might do well and someone might buy them. And what tends to happen at the moment is local governments and developers will say, okay, I need 500 trees or 5,000 trees, and go to the nursery industry and say, what have you got? And the nursery industry says, I've got jacarandas and ornamental pears because that's what sells well. And then the buyers will buy those, and then the nursery industry will say, well, that's what we're growing again next year. And so there's a real need to step in here and actually start saying, okay, we're going to do some work to develop some alternatives. That might mean that some of the government nurseries need to start growing some of these new potential species. There's also some really exciting work that we would like to do in developing some new species, new cultivars rather than species, for Adelaide conditions. And Adelaide actually has a history of doing this before. The claret ash was first developed here in Adelaide, and the South Australian flora has really been completely unexploited by the horticultural industry. So if you go to Bunnings and you buy a native tree, it will likely be from the East Coast or the West Coast, very unlikely to be either grown or provenance from South Australia. So there are some really exciting opportunities, but we probably don't have a nursery industry that's able to take some of the risks that are associated with that. And that's probably something that is going to need to be led by state and local government in the short term. And hopefully the nursery industry can be a partner in that and can take over that into the future.
Yeah, that's a fantastic opportunity to look into for South Australia. Definitely. There was one question here about the data on that you mentioned at the top there. Do all councils have that kind of data publicly available, like what you shared from Marion Council? So that's the tree by tree kind of asset, isn't it? Data.
Not all
Not
councils
all of them do,
will
yeah.
have it publicly available. Increasingly, I mean, elected members get really excited by it. And so a number of councils have invested in those data systems and have built public portals. So hop on your council website and see if you've got it. But if not, write a letter to your council and say, oh, I see that, you know, such city of such and such has it, and I'd like it too, because I think it's a pretty cool tool.
Yeah, it's awesome. Yeah, we might share some links to some of the known, council ones so that you can take a look and then, advocate for it in your local area as well, definitely. I think you've answered the first question from Rick, which is around, do shrubs have a role in canopy cover? So obviously you've been talking about the urban forest, not so much about urban biodiversity and that type of thing. So shrubs are not generally counted as canopy cover, are they?
It depends. So certainly in the LiDAR capture, I think that was a 3 meter cover. So everything that was higher than 3 meters is considered a tree for the purposes of that. In the there is no, I mean, the kind of ecological difference between a shrub and a tree is that a shrub has multiple stems and a tree has one. And so, you know, you can have a really small tree that looks like that, or you can have a really big shrub that grows up. And so it's not really very useful ecologically. We don't tend to plant lots of shrubs on our streets because they reduce visibility, and that's not generally something that residents are in favour of. So we don't plant shrubs as heavily, but as far as I'm concerned, in terms of building canopy, shrubs are great. They're just part of that diversity mix. They're increasing that functional diversity and that taxonomic diversity. So definitely part of the puzzle.
Definitely. Awesome. And there was a particular question around the table 2 that you shared from Amy, that the crepe myrtle was marginally useful up until 2070 and then suitable more so after 2070.
Yeah, it's a good spotting.
Good pick up, I know.
Yeah, I will go back to it.
Someone was paying attention to a table at 4:30 on a Tuesday.
Yeah, I'll just share it for anyone who missed it.
I definitely missed that bit. Good pick up, Amy.
One moment.
All good.
Okay, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, so Amy's talking about the row 13, the Lagerstremia indica, the crepe myrtle, which is marginal, and then suitable in 2070. This is an example of why I look at some of this and I'm a little bit suspicious. The way this data has been collected is they've taken the known native distribution of each species and then its cultivated distribution. And then they've looked at all of those climates, the climates in all of those areas, and then mapped that onto the future climate for, and in this case, it was the 5,000 postcode, so the city of Adelaide. I think that that's very unlikely to be the case. I can't see crepe myrtles becoming more suitable into the future. But these are the kind of artifacts that can crop up when you do this kind of modelling work. So I think what that shows to me is that, okay, this gives us a broad indication that a number of taxa are vulnerable and getting more vulnerable over time, but we've got a lot of work to do here in Adelaide in our local circumstances and with our local soils, because soils are going to be a big part of this because they affect water holding potential and therefore the performance of trees, to see which species are going to be resilient and which are not. And those that we're worried about, we need to start defraying those risks. So yeah, good pickup.
Going on from the previous question around species lists and nurseries, a question around the availability of seeds as well to actually grow. Do you have any insight on that? Grow diversity?
Not really. I mean, we have to be very mindful too that we don't just want to go nuts in planting, all kinds of things, and importing plants is inherently risky, and so important, particularly from overseas, but even from interstate. We've had outbreaks of myrtle rust on the east and west coast of Australia recently. That has the potential to be really devastating to our native ecosystems, but also many of our cultivated trees. We don't know how that's going to interact with climate change. It might dampen its effects, it might make it worse, and seeds being very easy to transport, we need to be mindful of what we're planting there. There's also weed potential. As I've been looking around in arid parts of the world, and what are they growing in Morocco? What's happening in Israel? What's happening in Mongolia? I've come up with a whole bunch of tree species that I would be interested in trialing here, and then very quickly identified that some of them are horrible, horrible weeds that we would never want. So we need to be mindful of that as well. So yes, getting access to stock is an issue, but we also need to be really careful about which stock we plant, because we don't want to be making mistakes, and we don't want to be introducing new pests and diseases or new weeds. So good consideration.
It's a complex area. Lots of trials, and it's fascinating to look at all that modelling, and still, yes, that modelling is useful, but then we still need to take a step back and actually see what that actually looks like in practice. And there was one question that I had personally, just when you were talking about in terms of the amazing work that arborists have done for many years, and is that do they have a network where they come together and share all that learning and data and that kind of thing? Is that TreeNet, or is there another group where they come together, or is it not formalized?
So there is a peak body for arborists called Arboriculture Australia. So they're a great resource to go to, particularly if you're interested in becoming an arborist or learning more about arboriculture generally. And that's a great professional association. TreeNet is a national body that we're lucky enough to host here in South Australia, or in Adelaide, and it actually was first hosted here at the Wade Arboretum, where I am at the moment. And TreeNet is a data sharing group that was founded to share all of the information of tree trials across Australia. And so they now have an online portal that you can visit that shows all of the known tree trials. That was only launched last year, and so there are many tree trials that aren't in there. But TreeNet has launched that to try and be the receptacle of people who are trying interesting things, and they will take that data and love it, so that others can benefit from that experience over time, because a lot of information was getting lost. Arborists were saying, okay, I'll plant this interesting thing, I'll try this thing out, and if it didn't work, then no one ever heard about it. If it did work, in many cases, no one heard about it. So sharing that information is super important. So TreeNet's a great resource. They have an annual symposium that is usually based here in Adelaide. And another fantastic thing about TreeNet is that all of the presentations from the TreeNet presentations, symposia rather, are available online. So you can watch them absolutely free. You don't need to be a member or anything like that. You can log in and you can see them there, including a talk very similar to this presentation that I gave at the symposium last year.
Brilliant. Yeah, there's just so much. Yeah, there's so many resources and things out there that people don't always know that exist, and work that's being done that now with new technologies and data sharing and having these portals, the way that information is shared and the knowledge can just be so much more broader than it was in the past. So yeah, we'll make sure that we share some more of those links and talks to those of you that want to delve in a little bit further. Is there any other key ones to direct people towards, Stefan, that you know of across Australia or even internationally, that off the top of your head?
No, I don't think so, but I'm happy to have a bit of a think and circulate those as part of the material that goes out after the presentation.
Yeah, brilliant. Excellent. Yeah, well, I think we've covered off on everyone's questions. So thank you so much again for your time, Stefan, and all of those insights, and that the challenge to keep on working in this area, and that more projects and more people need to collaborate as well on these things. And credit to all your collaborators as well. And thanks for being willing to share the data and share the story and kind of bolster everyone's knowledge so that they can practice differently if they're in that area, or we can advocate with our local governments and in our own backyards as well.
I really appreciate the opportunity. And we are currently in the process of scoping out the next stage of work, which will include a whole bunch more proactive work around which tree species to plant and so on. If you work for an organisation and or even if you don't and you're interested in learning more about that, or you have particular suggestions as to the work that we should be doing, I'd love to hear from you. So my email address, just Google me and I'm at Adelaide Uni, and my email address will also be in the material that's circulated. So very happy to chat to people about trees.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Yes, and we'll definitely send an email with all those links and direct things so that you can follow them up and share them with your colleagues and other people that didn't make it today. And our next session will follow on really lovely with this one on Wednesday, May the 22nd, which is going to be all about this urban greening strategy that many of you probably have participated in early workshops that it's being pulled together and being put out for consultation next week on the 30th of April. So there'll be a Your Say open, and we're having a number of workshops all over the place. So I'm sure many of you will be a part of those. But yes, really keen to get everyone's feedback and consultation on that strategy, which is really helping to tie together some of this amazing work that's happening in all of the different parts of Adelaide as well. So yeah, we'll send more information on this session and a link to register for the next one also in that email as well. And so we hope you can all join that. And yeah, lots of thanks coming through on the chat line, Stefan, for your time today. So thanks so much for joining in from 4 till 5, and we're finishing even with an early minute. So well done. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.